Ladies and gentlemen, the hearing stream 2 has reconvened after lunch break, and welcome to our submitters. Just before I do that, just to remind everybody to keep your cell phones on silent, please. So we welcome to the submitters table Napier City Council infrastructure team. So who do we have? Simon Bradshaw and Graham Thorpe.
Right, yeah.
Okay, so the floor is yours.
Thank you. I'll introduce myself first and then I'll let Graham do the same. So I am Simon Bradshaw, Manager of Infrastructure Developments, which is our infrastructure side of enabling growth within the Napier area. I have a background in civil and three waters engineering, with about 13 years experience in private consultancies before starting with council at the start of this year. I am a certified professional engineer with Engineering New Zealand, and also a certified member. I'll pass over to Graham to introduce himself.
Okay, thanks, Simon. I'm Graham Thorpe, Senior Services Engineer for the Napier City Council. Doing the services for the last almost 30 years. My 30 years comes up in January next year, so I've had a fair go at it. Prior to that, I was with Post Office and Telecom doing engineering work. And interestingly enough, when I started work in 1963, I spent the first few weeks rescuing our staff from flooding in the Onikawa area. So I've seen a fair bit of it around here since that time. So I've got some paper copies. Also got some. I can put these up on the screen.
Okay, we can see it on the screen too. In case you're wondering why we're not looking.
Thanks, Graham.
Thank you. That's great. At least one along that side. Do the other.
Thank you, Graham.
Right. Well, my problem at the moment is Simon's been doing all the submissions up to now. I only just started into it in the beginning of the week. And so I'm looking at it from the point of view of where the district plan's going and where problems we've got with infrastructure. So from an engineer's point of view, we're in a difficult position. The problem we've got is that the district plan's direction of high intensity infrastructure doesn't match our infrastructure in the ground, which is water, sewer, stormwater and roads. The concern is that if we can't mitigate the extra loading from the high intensity infrastructure, we may have to refuse development. As an engineer, I'm not sure who else can push that without it. But Napier's infrastructure is effectively low intensity. Now, the first slide I'll bring up for you is right one. Apologies, it's on its side, but it's the only way I could fit it all on the screen at once.
Right,
You've got the paper copy that's up the right way. This is a diagram of all the stormwater infrastructure we've got in Napier. Stormwater pipes in the city. And if you look at the legend, you'll see that the first two colours in the green are 0 to 50% loaded, so they can take more stormwater. The second green one, 50% to 100%, can take a little bit more. The rest of them, the red and the orange, are 100 to 200% overloaded, and the red 200% or more overloaded. So if you look at that map there and see where you can find some green bits, there's nowhere we can actually send more stormwater without causing problems to other infrastructure in the city or other buildings. You're putting all existing buildings at risk by developing and intensifying the runoff from rainfall events. And with people like the new government wanting to do fast track and install stuff without the infrastructure in place to take it, I don't quite know how we are going to join those two dots together. So just an example, it's 10. Oops. Crash. That's better. This is a copy of our GIS maps showing the areas flooded in a 50-year storm event. And that's, in particular, if you look at 65 Munro Street, which is if I can get this cursor to show up on here, I don't know if I can. Just in there. I can't see it on the screen there, I can see it on mine, but this big area in the middle here, which is the old railway yards. At the moment, that's acting as a big detention pond, and it does a great job of controlling stormwater and the rest of the flooded areas around that locality. So if you think about a good rainfall event, stormwater is going to start flooding all that area, but a lot of it goes into that big area at 65 Munro Street, and it stops the stormwater around, or the pond rising around the rest of that area. The problem we've got is that they're looking at wanting to put a 110 lot development in there, and I'll come back to that development a bit later, but effectively what happens when they put that in, they're working on putting 7,400 cubic metres of fill into that site to get the site up above the stormwater pond, which means it's no longer there for use as a detention pond. And the end result of that, when it rains, if there's no water can run in there to be detained, it's going to raise the level of the pond and put everyone else at risk. Yep. So, if you think about 7,400 cubic metres of fill, a normal swimming pool in a standard backyard's about 40 cubic metres. So there's a fair few swimming pools of water that it's going to displace. Now, when someone goes in to develop that site, they fill it, so we've got the problem of the stormwater being displaced. They've then got to control the stormwater there somehow so that they don't cause any more any stormwater to run off and cause that pond to rise even further. So the end result of that is that we need to find some way of dealing with it. So the developer's looking at increasing stormwater runoff. They're looking at putting in detention tanks on the site and increasing the runoff which needs to be discharged to the sea. Now, the only problem is we get something like $3.8 million of development contributions or financial contributions to upgrade infrastructure, and that development goes ahead. The cost of installing infrastructure for the stormwater alone is $50 million. They don't compute. So I'm not sure where we're going to get the difference and how we can allow a development to go ahead if we can't provide the infrastructure to go ahead. Okay, we're into 38. Now, just showing this is a development, this is a standard house that's in Wellesley Road, just close to the that development's in just behind that. And just looking at giving examples of what we use for pipe work for feeding that house. That's the size of a water pipe that we're feeding that house with the water supply. The pipe in the street outside is one that big, 50 mil, which is what we call a rider main, which they take connections off this to do that. On the other side of the street, you'd have another main, which is 100 mil diameter. That's got to provide firefighting capacity for the whole street. And it's got to provide the supply to the houses on the other side of the road. For sewer, that's a standard sewer pipe you would get in the street, 150 mil, with a connection to house connections, 100 mil. I'll just leave those there for now, because when you look at putting in high intensity infrastructure, you're looking at one property that's 35. There. Now there's some new high intensity infrastructure that's gone in just next door to that house that you've just been looking at in the previous slide. 9 units. Where does the stormwater go for a start? I'll just get another look at it. That's on one section equivalent to the house. That's a view of the same one from the road. So you can see there that it's virtually covering the whole site. There's next to no stormwater in the road at the moment, other than a couple of sumps and a 2D5 pipe that goes down the road to the roundabout a couple of sections away. And it's got a 2D5 diameter pipe, which is smaller than that. Sorry, slightly bigger than that. That's 150. It's 2D5 taking stormwater. There's a lot more stormwater flowing in pipes than you do in sewers. But when you start looking at that one, this was the high-sized water pipe that feeds the house next door. This is the pipe that's feeding this house, this set of 9 units, which is the same size as the pipe in the road. So somewhere along the line, council got to upgrade the infrastructure to handle that loading on the pipe. Okay, so you might say, well, if we do one development like this in the area, and pretty well what's happened, this one's come along and council have making allowances for covering it with existing infrastructure. As they start going down the road and doing another development like they have that looks like that, you now got same, that one's up to about 20 units on 2 sites, 2 residential sites. Their water supply connection to that one is one of these, which is the size of the big pipe on the other side of the road. So somewhere, if they keep going down Wellesley Road putting these sort of properties in, council's in trouble. Somewhere we've got to get enough sufficient money to upgrade not only the stormwater in the street outside, we've got to be able to feed it from wherever the reservoirs, the Millie Screen plant, getting the sewer to it. You've got to upgrade all of those to get there, so we've got to find some way of covering the payments for it. And this is where, as I say, the dilemma for us as engineers is trying to allow that to happen when you haven't got infrastructure, and then you can put the other buildings and businesses and everything else at risk because there's not enough infrastructure to cope with water, sewer, stormwater in particular. So now if you come back to the 29, there's this development that's going into 65 Munro Street. Well, this is what they're applying for at the moment, talking about it. As I say, we've got huge stormwater problem because they're displacing the stormwater out of the area of that where the development is and pushing it into the properties alongside. We've got to get stormwater pipes upgraded to a pump station, which is just at the right-hand side of that picture. And it needs a new outfall to the sea, so it needs bigger pumps and pipe work to the sea, something like, I don't know, do you know what size we're putting it?
It's currently 900 and it's considered to be 1.5 as conceptual sizing.
So that's sort of upgrading pipe size from a 900 to 1.5 metre and get that out. And it's talking something in the order of $50 million to do that. So unless we can get money to pay for it, I'm not sure how we're going to allow that to go ahead, because it can't go ahead until the stormwater can be catered for. So I think that's the general discussion of my comments at the moment. You want to?
Yeah. So yeah, I guess that's some context to some of the concerns. I acknowledge that the FC's chapter is in another hearing a bit later on, but we thought in this stage, being as we were talking about subdivisions, we could paint some context towards some of those concerns in the financial side of things. Coming back to natural hazards themselves, and some of the wording I think that I submitted on in the further submissions was trying to seek to avoid development in natural hazard prone areas, particularly with a focus on flooding, rather than, I think it talks to mitigating the risk at the moment. We thought it might be more appropriate to avoid where possible. And that, to give some more context to that, there's the HPRC scheme reviews that have come out recently that have a direct recommendation saying that our policy, or in that case the regional council's policy, needs to be stricter on preventing or avoiding subdivision in natural prone or flood prone areas. MFE have released a lot of different reports. One in February was around coastal hazard, and that talked to, I think, what we might experience now as a flood of about 1 in 50 years. We can expect to experience every year by 2050 if we continue on the current projections of our of what we're thinking where climate change is going. It's pretty scary. And then what Graham talked to, some of the history and the flooding that we've experienced here in Napier of late, and right back to, I think, was it 63 that Graham mentioned. Yeah, just maybe learning from that as well, and as best we can, and going towards. So hence why I asked in the further submissions to amend some of the wording to seek to avoid. Yeah, so I think that's a bit of a summary of giving some more context to those further submissions.
Okay, thank you. Just looking at your further submission, the further submission was lodged, as I can summarise it, to oppose the removal or reduction of financial contributions. So you are not here today to say the financial contributions are to be or should be increased, rather to prevent financial contributions from being removed.
Yeah, that was the specific one around the stormwater. Yeah, that was opposing that because, on the technical side of things, it didn't stack up, hence why the further submission said, yes, you are needing to be hydraulically neutral, I think is the new wording the PDP uses, up to the 10-year event. However, you still have water leaving your site because you still attenuate down to a flow. Your volume will increase, your flow will still be there, and so we'll still be servicing that right up to 10. And then like you pointed out, you've got the larger events that we still need to cater for as well. So we still need at least that. And then there's some other further submissions for the later hearing, which talk to the exemption zones and us wanting to reconsider those exemption zones because that's reducing our funding considerably, which goes a long way to addressing some of these capacity concerns that Graham's talked to.
The exemption zone for that 65 Munro Street's in the 50% exemption. So our $3.8 million of financial contributions we should be collecting is now down to 1.9 million. And you've still got 45 million to 50 million to cover just for stormwater, the outwater sewer, stormwater and roads.
And by hydraulic neutrality, does that mean that that development you showed us or others have to put in retention tanks and all that good stuff?
Yes, yeah, that's accurate. They have to up to a certain threshold, which is generally 1 in 10 year of the 10% AEP. However, I think there will be some other items that may require them to go further than that if they're in no and flood risk areas, but I believe currently it's just 10%.
Okay, thank you. Any questions from the panel?
Yes, thank you. Thanks, gentlemen. The two examples that you showed us of the multi-unit developments on Wellesley Road, did they involve subdivisions?
Yeah, they're a resource consent for subdivision for multi-unit developments, and they've effectively used up all the spare capacity in the network now.
Right.
So that we've taken account of that when we were doing the job. But now this 110 unit development comes along on the same basis. They've suddenly got nothing left to play with.
Thank you. I just, because we're looking at the subdivision provisions and the proposed district plan, and so I was just sort of thinking, okay, so how would this potentially address, your issue? So they did need a consent, and
Yes.
so presumably the stormwater was looked at. But now I understand when you said it's used up the capacity,
That's right. Yeah.
this particular case. I mean, plenty of soakage through gravel, I would have thought, in that area as well.
Oh no, it's not once you've covered the whole area with building.
Oh, okay. Bugger.
Yeah, that's the trouble. You see, there's each house. You look at each house there; it's only got less than 50% coverage and good drainage. As soon as you cover it with concrete, it's running off, and we cop it immediately, and we've got to get rid of it straight away.
Thank you.
Questions? Well, two things. One thing, that first map you showed there, just out of interest, there's a pipe going from basically the motorway bridge over the estuary, right through the estuary and out into the sea. Is that correct?
No. Well,
This one here, I think.
there is the estuary through there. Is that the one that goes out to sea at the Iron Pot?
Yeah.
That's part of the estuary.
So that's not a pipe. That's
No, it's not a pipe. No.
I wondered about that. Okay, well, thank you. And for the first time in 40 years nearly, it was good to see pipes and things actually when you talk about 10 and 20 and 50 and things to see what they actually looked like. So that was a good prop to have. So thank you very much.
No worries. Thank you.
Okay, thank you. Okay, our next submitter. Right, okay, you're on screen now. Can you hear us all right?
I can. Good afternoon. Can you hear me?
Yes, we can. Thank you very much. So, welcome to the hearing. We have read your pre-circulated evidence, so thank you very much. If you'd like to introduce yourselves to the hearing, and then the floor is yours in terms of talking to your evidence.
Thank you, Chair. My name's Anthony Blomfield. I'm a planner with the company Bentley & Co. And we've advised O Media and its predecessor, Adshell, for a number of years, myself personally for over 10 years now. And with me on the line, I have Mark Hundle. If you want to introduce yourself, Mark.
I'm head of commercial for O Media.
Thanks, Mark. So Mark hasn't circulated any evidence. He's just here today just in case any questions arise that could use Mark's in-house expertise. But otherwise, it's my evidence that you have read, planning evidence on behalf of the submission of O Media. And I thought today I would quickly skim through the summary that was in my evidence, which is section 3 of my evidence. And I will try to make that quick. And at the end, I just had 1 or 2 comments just to make in response to the summary prepared by the Council's officer this morning on the signs chapter. So in terms of the summary of my evidence, I'll skip through some of the front end of this. Obviously, I introduce it there at 3.1 of my evidence that O Media is a provider of out-of-home advertising on bus and pedestrian shelters and other types of infrastructure throughout New Zealand. In Napier, they have a contract with Napier City Council to do this on some bus shelters within the city. And O's model is essentially to provide that infrastructure to the council and to the community free of cost, which is obviously underpinned by the revenue generated by the advertising itself. The advertising products that we're talking about are the signs that are integrated with bus shelters that you'll have seen throughout the city and in other parts of the country. They are what I would call small scale, typically between 2 and 3 square meters, no more than 1.5, 2 meters high, and they're integrated with shelters such as bus shelters. So they're not large format billboards or that sort of format of out-of-home advertising. They are quite discrete, as in they're their own discrete product within a broader industry. I'll skip through to 3.4. O's submission was concerned with the manner in which the proposed district plan provided for integrated third-party advertising with network utilities, and that it didn't provide for them other than in the same way that it provides for all third-party advertising, which is with a discretionary activity status. And this is notwithstanding that it probably goes without saying, but I've said it in the evidence anyway, that the proposed district plan does provide for network utilities and their benefits, and so on and so forth. I'll skip through 3.5, 3.6. The council's response to sorry, I should have skipped through 3.6. Those submissions sought bespoke provisions, and these are very much consistent with what I have ended up recommending in my evidence, which is that there should be a policy to enable signs that are integrated with network utilities. There should be a permitted activity status for such signs integrated with network utilities, and some accompanying standards so that they are managed in locations and in situations where it's appropriate to do so. And then where there's an infringement to one of those standards, that a restricted discretionary activity status would apply, and some matters of discretion assessment criteria are applied in that situation. The council's response has not been to accept this submission. and the response is that the provisions as they are notified are sufficient to provide for this form of advertising, sufficient being the word in the summary. In the 42A report, the response was that the provisions sought by O are not aligned with the intent of the signs chapter. In my evidence in part 5, I have explained the provisions in the proposed district plan for network utilities. I think I can very briefly summarise that by saying that the plan tries to provide for them and their benefits and then tries to manage their adverse effects. It's a very, very simplistic summary of those provisions. And then in terms of signs, I think what's important here, and something that I was mulling over earlier, having read the summary statement of the council's officer, is that the objectives and policies for signs in the proposed district plan are not simply to manage signs. That's the response in the 42A report to O's submission, is that having a permitted I should say a bespoke set of provisions for these types of signs is not aligned with the intent of the proposed district plan, which is to manage the effects of signs. And in doing so, one of the policies has been flagged. But in my view, and I'm now speaking outside of the evidence that's on the page, as in I'm doing further summary, I think the objectives and policies go beyond that. I don't think that it is adequate to say, or accurate to say, that they are only trying to manage the effects of signs. Objective 1 is signs that meet the needs of the community and do not detract from the visual amenity of the area. Objective 2, well-designed and appropriately located signage enhances city vibrancy, ensures public and transport safety, and contributes to community well-being. Policy 1, very clearly provide for positive effects of signs on the environment. And the policies then go on in terms of having, I guess, a bit more of a focus on the management of adverse effects. So I don't think that it is, well, I think it is simplistic to say that the objectives and policies seek to manage the effects of signage only, and that a bespoke set of provisions for signs on network utilities are misaligned with that purpose. I don't read the proposed provisions in that manner. I guess to summarise my recommendation, having considered all of the objectives and policies, is I do consider that a bespoke set of provisions is appropriate. This is both in having regard to the scale and the nature of the signs that are core to O's operations. As I said, small of scale, integrated with network utilities, managed appropriately, and so on and so forth. And I think that it is appropriate to then have provisions which effectively trigger resource consents in other situations, such as when they're within a residential zone, a rural zone, open space zone, where they're proximate to heritage items or scheduled heritage items, then located on sites of significance to Māori, and then having further standards, or rather cross-referencing to other existing standards around the control of the illumination and operation of digital signs. And that an infringement to any of those standards can be adequately managed by way of a restricted discretionary activity status. That is the summation of the provisions that I'm recommending, again, having regard to those things. And then just to come back to my point about what the objectives and policies are trying to seek, and the way in which this has been assessed or responded to by the council officer, it's not about whether the provisions are sufficient to manage the effects of signage. As I've said, the objectives policies, I don't believe, are exclusively targeted at managing adverse effects. They go beyond that, but also pursuant to Section 32 of the RMA, it's not about whether they're sufficient. It's about having or examining the appropriateness of provisions. And one of the key steps in this examination is assessing the efficiency and effectiveness of the provisions in achieving the objectives. And so sufficiency of the provisions in managing adverse effects, I think, is A, the wrong test, and B, the wrong outcome of the objectives. I have provided a Section 32AA assessment in my evidence at the back end of the evidence to examine the options, including the status quo, or rather the provisions proposed by the council officer and my own. And having done that, I the opinion that the provisions that I've recommended are the most appropriate set of provisions to achieve the objective.
Sorry, we're having trouble hearing you, Anthony.
When did I cut out?
Just about a few seconds ago. So can you just say that last bit again?
Essentially, in summary, having done a 32AA evaluation, I consider that the provisions that I recommend are the most appropriate provisions to achieve the objectives. And I might switch over to a different headset. I was worried this might happen. But that is the summary and conclusion of my presentation.
Okay, thank you. Did you swap over first? Okay, good to go? Oh, yeah. Can you hear me now?
I can hear you. Can you hear me?
I can hear you, that's good.
I apologize for that. I look very businesslike now.
Just one question of language. So you're referring to the types of signage you're wanting to be addressed by the plan as component of network utilities. And I'm just wondering, as very much as a planner, why network utilities and not infrastructure? Because when I look at the meaning of infrastructure, it includes, where are we now? Structures for transport on land by roads, etc. So why are these things treated as, or should be treated as network utility structures? Can you just help me there?
In this instance, I was using the language already existing within the proposed plan, which is I had reference to the chapter that is titled Network Utilities. I've seen in other, I guess, new generation district plans that it's often called infrastructure. I'm not too sure why it's a different term, but in my view, it's potato in terms of what I'm talking about.
Okay, I may ask the officers just to clarify if they think bus stops, etc., are network utilities or infrastructure. Thank you for that. Any questions from the panel? No? While you're thinking, I can ask one.
Yeah,
Okay.
through you, Mr. Chair. I think it's more a question for the reporting officers and their in their response report is if we could be persuaded that a bespoke set of rules are required to deal with either infrastructure or network utilities along the lines of the recommendations of the submitter, is there an opportunity to potentially work on what that wording could look like with the submitter and find some consensus?
Okay, and just one final question from me too. So, I mean, one purpose for providing these types of signs as a permitted activity is to avoid the double dipping, that's not the right phrase, but for getting approvals from the council under the bylaw for public spaces and as well as getting resource consent. Is that correct?
Yes, that is one outcome, one benefit of this approach.
Okay. And what does involve? What's involved with getting the council's approval for a sign in a public place? Do you know that off the top of your head?
I do not. I haven't been through that process myself. The bylaw, actually, I would need to check if the bylaw specifies what that process involves or whether it's internally known within the council, but I can't answer that right now.
Okay, I think that's another matter to ask the council officers, is just to clarify what that process is under the bylaw. Okay, thank you. I have no further questions. Any further questions? No? Well, thank you very much for your attendance and for your evidence. So thank you very much.
Thank you, Chair. Thank you, Commissioners.
Thank you. I think we have one more submitter for the day. Two? Oh, thank you. Where's my list? So we have Hawke, New Zealand. We have Leanne Roberts and Charlotte Jury, who has provided both fulsome planning evidence and a summary thereof, both of which we've read. So thank you. just turn to your summary. So the floor is yours.
Thank you very much, and good afternoon. Yes, I'm Charlotte Drury. Leanne Roberts is tied up with another meeting about the Napier and Hastings future development strategy, so she's not here with us this afternoon. But I guess in the interests of time efficiency, I won't go back through my evidence. I guess I'd just like to emphasise there are two quite specific requests that we have, quite peculiar, I think, to horticulture. And so it was great to have this opportunity to provide additional information because I certainly understand that there are things that we need as a horticulture sector, which the reasons for which are not necessarily always apparent on the face of it. So I guess those two key things is a permitted activity rule, which enables the burying of material infected by unwanted organisms in the event of a biosecurity incursion. This is something that I think has become more, we've become more aware of the need for it after the PSA incursion, which affected the Bay of Plenty more, but obviously kiwifruit orchards and so on up there. And it certainly was the case that there was delays in the ability of the hort sector to respond because of the need to get consents under some of the district plans up there. And that's certainly something that we're looking to avoid here. I think there's precedent in terms of permitted activity rules of this nature, including with our neighbours in the Hastings district. And I guess potentially one of the sort of components of it is understanding the potential quantum of material that might need to be buried. It might be that entire orchards need to be cut down and buried. Burning is sometimes an option, but that depends on the organism, and it also depends on the time of year. So, for example, if something happened and it was in February to March, when it's getting close to the time that you harvest grapes, they're really sensitive to picking up smoke, and that can taint the flavour of the grapes at that time. So at that particular time, it would certainly not be in anyone's interest to be burning material that could then have an impact on the taste of those grapes. And again, obviously, the ability to respond as quickly as possible. None of us know what the next incursion might be, but it is that ability to respond and get onto things as quickly as possible, because here in Hawke's Bay, we have the greatest number of apple orchards anywhere in New Zealand. We have a huge amount of permanent horticulture here. And so the ability to be able to respond and limit the spread of anything as quickly as possible is really, really important. The second thing which we're seeking is a rule which explicitly permits ancillary rural earthworks in the rural lifestyle and production zones. And again, this, I guess, is something which is unique to the horticulture sector. The cultivation definition explicitly excludes, the earthworks definition explicitly excludes cultivation and disturbance associated with fence posts. But the example which I provided in my evidence was that of orchard redevelopment. Orchard redevelopment can be required under a multitude of different reasons. It might be that you are planting an orchard again after a biosecurity incursion, for example. Bits of orchards needed to be replanted after the cyclone. It might be responding to market conditions. Apple trees have about a 20-year life cycle, so there is also a need to simply just replace plants as they get to the end of that life cycle. And obviously, in terms of people's demands, in terms of the types of apples and so on that they're enjoying eating, constantly new brands, new varieties and stuff in development, and real focus in, I guess, that sort of species development now is trying to develop cultivars which don't require as many chemicals to be applied, because you can manage them in terms of what they are susceptible to and reduce the amount of sprays and so on that are needed on them. So some really exciting things happening in that space. But going back to the matter of orchard redevelopment, that can potentially have a raft of different activities associated with it. So the first one would be removing trees, and you need to make sure you get the whole tree out as well as the root, because otherwise disease can remain in the soil, which could affect the new orchard. So that's one activity. Drainage in some areas, particularly some patches of Bay View, the drainage out there is not great. If you're redeveloping an orchard, that's potentially an opportune time to put in tile drainage. That necessitates the digging of trenches to say 1.4 metres deep. You might space those between what your orchard rows are going to be. So straight away, you're pretty quickly going to be exceeding that 100 metres cubed permitted activity threshold. Root ripping, like when you're replanting the vegetable garden, you'll go through with your fork and really work the soil and loosen it up to get as much oxygen and so on in there as possible. There's a similar process gone through when you're going through orchard redevelopment to do that. Then you're also planting, and a lot of new development now is moving towards 2D planting systems, and they have a lot more crop support structures. 2D is what is going to facilitate more robotic picking in the future. And so the trees are effectively only grown in 2 dimensions. So they are sort of, you've got to support them more because they're a bit unbalanced because they go outwards but not that way. So that again necessitates the need for more earthworks to put in support posts to create those big long structures that you see in the newly developed orchards now. And in addition to those, there's also some growers, when you're investing all that money in redeveloping, might also look to put in other bird netting or hail protection covers as well. So those big structures go over the top of the crop support structures, and again can necessitate the need for quite big fence or poles to support those big structures, the netting structures that go over the top. So when you think of all of those things, you can see how very, very quickly you are potentially going to exceed that permitted activity threshold. I guess the other thing is as well is that when you're doing a redevelopment project, you get in and you get it done. You don't space it out so that you can just do 100 cubes of earthworks each year. You need to get in, spend the money, and then get back and get growing so that you can get a return on that investment as soon as possible. So, basically, that is the reasons for those 2 key changes that we're seeking. And now just happy to answer any questions or provide any more clarification that might be needed.
Thank you. I've got a couple. Okay. In terms of the biosecurity emergency, would Section 330 of the RMA deal with these sorts of situations as an emergency works?
As far as I understand it, the ability to declare a biosecurity incursion is under the Biosecurity Act, and I understand the Biosecurity Act is also being reviewed at the moment as well. But in terms of the way, the ability to bypass RMA restrictions, as I understand it, sits only in the Biosecurity Act. So it's got to be a declaration by the minister, and that has for some reason never happened. I'm not sure why that is, but it was only in the PSA incursion, it was only the chief technical officer, and if the declaration comes through them, there's not the ability to bypass it. So, yeah.
Okay, so basically you're saying that these sort of situations wouldn't be covered by Section 330 of the RMA?
No, that's as far as I'm aware, and it was my personal involvement was predated by the PSA incursion. It was that obviously wasn't used in the PSA incursion up there. There was definitely cases of growers having to get resource consent. So I'm not quite sure why, sorry.
Right.
But yeah, that has been the experience of the sector up until now.
So if I understand you correctly, what would be involved would be digging huge holes, because an orchard could be quite a substantial amount of volume in terms of trees and things being cut down. Huge holes being buried, and then would you have surplus fill after that, or would you have a huge mound? How does it work in practice?
That's a good question, that question of fill. I think it would be, and it depends again on the incursion, about the depth at which you need to actually bury as well, because for some particular organisms, they need to be deep buried. But I guess and I'm clearly not an earthworks expert in terms of how you do it, but I think the issue potentially more is the space that you need to create, so that then you can get the trees in there. Burning is the easiest answer because it obviously, putting aside effects on the air quality, but then you're not left with any kind of residuals. It is
Volumes.
exactly, yes. So my understanding is it's a bigger, a sort of shallower hole, and I guess you've got the whole area of the orchard within which you can do that, and then the material must just break down over time. So
You have a sinking lid kind of.
exactly, yes, yeah, that would be my
And
understanding.
burning would involve emulants, is that the right word? Because it's all green wood, so you
Yes.
would have to apply something to get it burning or whatever.
Yes, yeah, yeah.
Just in terms of the other outstanding issue, in terms of ancillary rural earthworks, you're talking about rural lifestyle as well as the production zones. And by production zones, I'm guessing you mean the rural production zone and the general rural zone as well?
Yes, that's correct, yes.
Not just the rural production zone. So
Yes.
why the rural lifestyle zone? Is there a lot of orcharding or horticulture that goes on?
I don't think there's a lot, but there are certainly some small blocks in those areas. In particularly, Bayview is quite a special area particularly for stone fruit across New Zealand. So some of the blocks are quite small, and they'll grow just perhaps one variety or get cherries that Bayview is normally at least 1 or 2 weeks ahead of even the rest of Hawke's Bay. And so some of the blocks are quite small, but they will sell on the domestic market. Yeah.
Okay. And the definition for ancillary, you're suggesting that list that was in your evidence, paragraph 19, that would form the basis of a definition for ancillary? Because I imagine for council processing something or trying to assess whether it needs consent,
Yeah.
they needed some guidance if
Yes.
they're not an expert in horticulture
Yes.
as to what would be involved.
Yes, yeah. So yes, we have suggested that that would provide some guidance. It may need some help. Obviously, the definitions is another chapter, and it's always challenging to write things like this when you're not quite aware of how much more you know than a consent officer who's dealing with it. So there's that testing there, and obviously when the definitions chapter is the hearings on that might help flesh that out a little bit, whether or not there might need to be some further clarifications potentially added into that definition.
You haven't got any model definition at hand, do you?
I think this is it. Yeah, I think this is based on submissions and other plans around the country. It's certainly not an issue that's peculiar to Napier City. It's something that Hort NZ has had a need to explain and get into other district plans around the country.
Okay, thank you. Any questions on the panel?
Thanks, Dr. Drury. Look, just a couple of follow-up questions from me, because actually Commissioner Schofield's probably asked the key ones. But in the officer's report on page 135, on paragraph 135, page 28, she talks about considering further information from Horticulture New Zealand with regard to the obstacles which exist under current legislation. And is there anything else that we need to be aware of? Any other obstacles, obviously apart from waiting for a declaration from the Minister of Primary Industries or whoever does that?
As it happens, there are actually issues in the regional plan in Hawke's Bay, which we are aware we need to tackle at the appropriate time in terms of the ability to clear Indigenous vegetation in that particular case around vegetation clearance. So yes, Napier City, the proposed plan is certainly not the only obstacle, but we are working through them as they present themselves to try and get as seamless a process as possible. Because I guess the key thing is really that, when something like PSA occurs, it's incredibly stressful for growers involved in it, and we want to try and make the process of responding to it as easy as possible.
And I guess some part of that is speed of response, isn't it?
That's right, yes.
And just the other question, again, following up on the ancillary earthworks, it's happened in other areas of the country. Do you actually have a rule that...
Drafting?
Yeah.
Not in front of me, but certainly happy to work up drafting for a role. Yes.
Cool.
Yep.
Thank you.
Yep.
Thanks.
Thank you very much, Charlotte. I think that would be really helpful, the drafting of that rule. I did just want to ask you if you had an opportunity to review the Transpower submission. I don't think you mention it in your further submission or your summary today, but that was the only opposition to the ancillary rural earthworks.
Yes,
point.
I do. I did read it, but my memory's not great, so remembering some of the specific detail may elude me.
That's all right. It was just in regards to the earthworks not being then subject to the National Grid Yard earthworks rule.
Yeah, and that's certainly not what we're seeking. Horticulture New Zealand and Transpower has engagement over these matters throughout the country, and so that is something, and I think from memory in some other plans there is some depth restrictions around it, because you're certainly not wanting a giant crop protection structure within the National Grid Yard, but it's understanding not having unnecessary restrictions in that space. And I think particularly within the Napier district, where it's not a particularly extensive, the National Grid isn't massive, that we could certainly work through that.
Yeah, perfect. Thank you. I think if you are in a frame of mind to do some drafting, that's something to be considered as well.
Yeah, sure.
Okay, thank you, Dr. Jury. I don't have any further questions, so thank you for coming and answering our questions.
Cool. Thank you very much for your time.
Thank you. And our last submitters for the day, we've got Jason Tickner here. Hello. So we've got your presentation. I'll just turn to my paper copy of it as well. So I think your presentation will come online shortly, hopefully. There it is. We can now see it. We can't hear you at the moment. Can you
hear me now, sorry?
try again?
Can you hear me now?
Yes, that's better. So more than happy for you to lead us through your presentation.
Nice, thank you. And my name's Jason Tickner. I'm today representing Keith Peacock and Jeff Reid in regard to their submissions number 136 and 164 on the proposed district plan. Jeff and Keith should be in the room. If you put your hands up, identify yourself.
Yep.
And I apologise I couldn't be there today in the other island, but thank you for having us and letting us speak to our submission. First, I'd like to acknowledge the hard work that Council have done getting to this point. It's always a big job doing a district plan review, so we definitely thank the Council for it. And in regard to our submission, for clarification, that the points that we raise are in relation to submissions 136.2 and 164.2, which are specifically in regard to the removal or request of the removal of the average lot size for the large lot residential zone, which is the next slide. Sorry, do I have ability to change those slides, or does it have to be changed by?
Yep.
Thank you.
No, it's changed. Yep.
So the submissions made by Jeff and Keith have both been, there is a wider submission recommending or requesting a zone change. We kind of accept that is a large jump for Council to move to, but the intent of this points here to basically allow the remaining large lots left in this large residential zone that is subsequent from the earlier development happening to be subdivided effectively and not be, I suppose, tied to those average lot sizes that were historically the zonings that was placed on that area before it was developed. So moving on to the next slide, thank you. What I've done briefly is identified the sites in question. So this area of Kent Terrace is identified as large lot residential in the proposed plan. The area with the red is the boundary of the zoning, And those areas that I've clouded identify, I suppose, the last remaining large lots from the original development, the balance lots, I'll call them. All those lots are between 6,000 square metres up to 3 hectares. There's roughly 8 properties, or there is 8 properties, and 2 of those are of the submitters, so I'm speaking on behalf of today. So those are basically the sites that are the remaining, if the rule was to be changed, those are the sites that would impact in regard to ability for them to be developed to a higher density than what's currently permitted or proposed. Next slide, thank you. So the reasoning, or the fundamental reasoning in our submission is the first point was it's the opinion of me and Mr. Peacock and Mr. Reid that by allowing a high density of subdivision here down to the 1,000 square metre minimum opposed to the 3,000 average will provide the highest density of subdivision to get the best effective and efficient use of the existing infrastructure that is already laid for this development. This entire development area is already serviced by Three Waters, roading infrastructure, power and telecommunications. And basically that direction is pretty clearly supported through the regional plan, especially policy UD1 that identifies that intensification must take place over as a priority in urban development areas that ensures effective utilisation of the existing infrastructure. So, and that lies with the TAs to implement that policy. So I think that's the first point that we wanted to clearly raise is that we believe this clearly aligns with the policy and regional direction to effectively use that infrastructure. Next slide, thank you. The second point we wanted to raise was by providing a higher density in these areas, it does take or alleviate some pressure off the fertile soil resource of the Heretaunga Plains, which I don't need to speak of in too much detail to signify its importance. But by dropping it in an area like this, it aligns with the underlying policies. And again, I'll go back to the regional plan, the HPUDs, which I do know is being superseded at the moment, and the protection of the soil resources under the national policy statement. Again, aligning with the objectives UD1 of the compact form and UD2 of intensification of residential areas under the regional plan. So aligning very strictly with what the overarching policy direction by a regional council is. Next slide, please. The third point of our submission is that this area being elevated and is clear of a lot of those hazards that Section 106 requires us to avoid. It's not prone to liquefaction or flooding or the coastal inundation or tsunami risks that you get with a number of the areas on the plains and on the coastal fringes, which are, as we've seen in 2020 and the recent cyclones, are prone to those flooding events. So again, by allowing a high density here, we are providing supply to the market of residential housing, which can avoid those effects and basically provide resilient housing for our community. Next slide, thank you. The fourth point is that the amenity effects, in my opinion, as the planner representing Mr. Reid and Mr. Peacock, is that there'll be only minor effect. We're still not proposing to remove or council to change the minimum lot size. That would still be set at 1,000 square metres, which is still a large residential lot in this day and age. But the land bulk and location standards and land use standards would still suffice in managing a lot of those effects. The zone already has a higher requirement in regard to provision of landscaping at 50%. It requires a provision of site coverage no more than 500 squares or 25% of the site, whichever is the lesser. There's already a number of strong land use provisions and rules there to manage those amenity effects. And it's also worthy of note that the site itself is not in a significant landscape character area and is zoned residential under the current district, under the proposed district plan. Next slide, please. And I don't need to speak to this to too much detail, but in my opinion, it's clear that the relief sought to allow for or to drop their average lot size and have it just as a minimum lot size, provides that slight intensification over what's already permitted. It is clearly any additional houses we can get on those foothills of Taradale is clearly aligning with our national policy statements around productive land, urban development and H-PLUDs, and in my opinion, will align with that future urban development strategy that is currently being consulted at the moment. I don't see the fundamentals of that changing. Protection of the soil resource is going to be number one, and ensuring we develop in safe places for our community. And I believe what has been proposed in our submission aligns with all of these strategic and policy directions. Next slide, thank you. Just briefly, I did want to speak to the Council's officer's recommendation for rejecting our proposal to drop the average lot size. Basically, it's drawn more or less into 2 points: that it could significantly impact the anticipated density and functionality of the zone. Naturally, I disagree with that. We've got land use standards there that control the overall amenity effects in there. The land itself that is left remaining, some of it is of steeper topography, which will also control it. I don't, in my professional opinion, I don't believe it could be subdivided down to 1,000. A lot of those lots, 1,000 square metres, just due to the topography, but there could be a higher density than what's currently proposed at 3,000 average. So I don't believe that the density impact and the functionality of the zone is completely going to change because of these 8 additional properties having some additional development rights, providing that 1,000 square metre average is retained. The second point raised by the assessing planner was that, in their view, any such change would necessitate consultation with affected landowners. Now, again, in my opinion, the proposal went through notification. Further submissions were open to all of the public. There has been a process that has been followed in that respect for people to make submissions, albeit there is a number of submissions on the district plan, so I don't expect everyone to cover everything. But the other point I'd like to raise, and it's probably relatively prudent to our proposal, is that the adjoining rural residential zone, it's proposed by the processing planner that the average lot size of 1.5 hectare is actually abolished, and that the rural residential zone just next door to the current zone we're talking to in our submission is dropped completely, and it's set at just the minimum lot size of 5,000 squares. Fundamentally, that's an increase in density of 3 times if it was taken at the purest form. But fundamentally, that's exactly the same thing we're applying for, but the assessment has been that it's not appropriate for this residential zone to have more intensification, yet appropriate on the adjoining zone. For many of the same reasons we've argued in our submission. So next slide, thank you. So just in closing, we accept that council may see it, or sorry, the chair and commissioners may see it as a bridge too far when we eventually get to the hearings on the rezoning of the site. But this submission in particular, we believe, is the right balance to remove that 3,000 square metre lot average and let the 1,000 square metre minimum be the controls for development in this residential zone. It's my opinion that by doing so, it will provide for the logical and sustainable development of these remaining large parcels and take pressure off our fertile soil resource while effectively using the existing infrastructure that's on site, which aligns with well, in my opinion, all the strategic and national policy direction I can see. So I do thank you for your time, and I'm happy to take any of your questions.
Thank you for that. Any questions from the panel?
Yes, please. Thank you very much, Mr. Tickner. Liz Lambert here. I'm just looking at the map that you had in your presentation, which shows the large lot residential zone. Am I correct? The red is the large lot?
The red outline, yeah,
The red
is
outline,
my,
yeah.
yeah.
So
yeah.
a fair proportion of it's already been developed, hasn't it?
Completely, yep.
Terrace and Outlook Terrace and so forth. So what's the density like in the areas that have already been developed? Do you know?
Yes, basically the foot of the valley, which is the main road, which is Kent Terrace, and if you've got that slide in front of you, you'll see is the main road in there. Basically, all those lots along that road are practically around 1,500 square metres. They're already, in my opinion, residential in nature. And I don't want to speak to our other submission about the zoning, but that was part of the argument why we believe the zoning and the densities could be changed. As you get to the top of Kent Terrace, the lots do get larger as the topography changes. But again, from my measuring and observations, they're still around 1,500 to 2,500 square metres on average.
Thank you. And look, and irrespective of, I mean, no, the topography will dictate in some ways in any event what a lot size would be. But what you're asking for is, rather than having to use an average, that you have a minimum, it will almost inevitably be a bit bigger than that, if you need to get a building platform, etc. But, okay. And that's for those areas that look like little clouds.
Yeah, sorry. Yep, I drew those in clouds, but yeah, that's exactly the areas that I was referring to.
Cool. Thank you.
Yeah, no, thank you. Jason Annette here. My primary question was a natural justice one, but I think you have covered that off in your presentation, so I'm quite clear. Thank you.
Thank you, Nick.
Okay, just a couple of questions. While we're talking, I did a quick street view tour of Kent Terrace, and a lot of those sites, admittedly not all of them, but a lot of those sites are fairly steep sites. But are you saying you do not see any geotechnical sort of Section 106 issues in terms of that side of things?
Oh yeah, thank you for that question. Yes, I from my knowledge of the area and involvement in earlier subdivisions in that zone, typically the geotechnical reports coming back do allow there is suitable ground from the likes of the developments up Ridgeway Terrace relatively recently. There is always, when building on hills, a risk of landslide. It's always something, but that is something that, in my opinion, would be addressed through any subdivision consenting around suitability of land platform. And from my investigations, I couldn't see that it was identified in any land subsidence hazard layers, this area. So yeah, I do accept that any development, if it was to happen in this space, would be subject to geotechnical investigations, and as the chair's alluded to, there would definitely be the topography would control the overall development density in there. I no way believe that you'd end up with, in that last 10 hectares at 1,000 squares, that you'd end up with 100 houses in there, for example. It would be probably half of that, in my opinion.
Okay. And the only other question on that aerial plan, there's 4 sections outlined in light green. Can you tell me what they are about?
Very good observation. Yeah, that's a recent subdivision which hasn't yet got title. So these plans are from the council's planning maps, and new subdivisions that don't have title yet are shown in green, and that shows, quite ironically, a perfect example of the density that can be achieved if the lot sizes are dropped I can't speak specifically to that submission, but I assume they've gone through a non-complying resource consenting route to gain that density, but again, without reading the actual subdivision application that had been lodged for that specific site, I can't speak any more detail on that, but yes, that's what that is.
Thank you. I don't have any further questions, so thank you. No, thank you very much for presenting to us and answering our questions. We appreciate that. So thank you, and to the two at the back, thank you.
Thank you.
Cheers.
Thank you for your time.
Okay, day one is now complete, and we shall adjourn the hearing until 9 o'clock tomorrow morning. So thank you, everyone.